Today we are going to be talking about one of the strangest stories I have ever read, and that is The Caterpillar by Edogawa Ranpo. I covered another Ranpo story last week, and that is because he has a knack for creating some of the most bizarre and unsettling horror stories I have ever had the misfortune of reading. So without further ado, let's get into the story that made me the most uncomfortable I have ever been while reading a piece of fiction. Let's get into The Caterpillar by Edogawa Ranpo. The story starts with a woman named Toko walking to the guest house in which her and her husband had been staying. She recalls a conversation she just had with the master of the house, General Washio, in which he had praised her on her devotion to her husband and how not once in the last 3 years had she complained or thought about herself. Despite him meaning well, Toko hated talking to the general. Although at first she enjoyed his praises, now the same words of admiration, instead of tickling her vanity, filled her with this intense feeling of guilt and shame. She thought of her husband, a strong man once named Lieutenant Sangaga. However, now the word disabled was not enough to describe the condition he was in. The general lived rurally, and despite the relatively short walk between the main house and the guest lodgings, she still had to be careful as it was not uncommon for snakes to be hiding in the tall grass. It also didn't help that there was an old well that had become so overgrown with weeds that one wrong step could lead to a serious injury. It was dark, and despite her mixed emotions towards her husband, she still felt bad. She didn't mean to stay out as long as she did, and without her being there to light a lamp, her husband was left to sit alone in the darkness. She enters the house and is greeted by a familiar thumping noise. The former Lieutenant Sangaga is banging his head against the ground again and again in almost this mechanical way, something like the churning of an old machine. The woman scolds the man despite his deafness for hitting his head against the floor. She then grabs a notepad and pen and places the pen within the man's disfigured mouth. She holds the paper up to his face, and with great difficulty he scribbles a single word. The word is where. The woman snatches the pencil from the man's mouth and scribbles her reply. Visiting Washio. She apologized for taking as long as she did, despite knowing he could not hear her. The woman looked at her husband. The explosion had damaged his face beyond recognition. However, one thing had stayed the same. Despite the many surgeries, this lump of flesh still had her husband's eyes. He stared at the woman, and despite losing his vocal cords, those eyes were still able to say so much. And that's probably why Toko couldn't bear to look at them. Toko apologized again, bending over to kiss her husband. She closed her eyes so she didn't have to see his face, and meditated on that strange, familiar desire that was boiling up inside of her. Although at first the man enjoyed the touch of her lips, he soon began to writhe in agony. The lump of flesh squirmed and squirmed, trying to get out from under her. However, Toko kept kissing him, covering his mouth with hers. The former Lieutenant Sangaga struggled desperately for breath as he contorted his mangled face as he tried to find air. Eventually, the man did manage to free himself. However, this filled Toko with rage. Out of anger, she yanked the man's kimono as hard as she could, causing the strange lump of flesh to roll out. She gazed upon her husband and was filled with disgust at what the doctors described as an unprecedented miracle. She looked at the yellowed lump of flesh before her and the scars from where its arms and legs had been severed. Despite its reduced size, the lump of flesh that others called her husband had grown fat, as all it could do was eat. It was almost totally immobile, with the most it being able to do was to lay on its distended and bloated yellow belly and use its protrusions to spin. The lump of flesh reminded Toko of one of those old spinning tops. However, this one was made from sickly yellowed meat. However, what the former Lieutenant Sangaga mainly reminded her of was a large yellow caterpillar. Looking at the caterpillar, it was easy to forget it was human. However, it always did have that unmistakable reminder. Those two eyes that Toko could never ignore provided just a small window for what was left of the man to gaze helplessly at the outside world. The woman gets ready for bed and goes to sleep. However, she awakens screaming. She takes a moment to gather herself before looking over to see if she woke her husband. The caterpillar was staring at the ceiling without blinking. Toko Tokiko is then hit by an intense feeling of grief as she recalls seeing her husband for the first time in that hospital. When the doctors pulled back the sheet to reveal just a bandaged torso, they told her it was a miracle that he was able to survive. But even then, Tokiko knew that the word miracle was not an accurate description of what she was seeing. After he was discharged, her husband's pension was not enough to support them both, but luckily her husband had served under a generous man named Mr. Washio, who took them in and allowed them to reside in his guest house. At first, her husband would frequently scribble the words paper using his mouth, and Tokiko would hold up newspaper clippings detailing his heroics from his time in the military. She would hold these clippings up for hours as he read and reread them. However, as time passed, he asked for them less and less. She didn't mean for it to happen, but over time, she noticed she was becoming meaner to her husband. The two of them were practically alone in the countryside, and with only the general to talk to, and that being far from a pleasant experience, Tokiko had to find company in what was left of her husband. Despite appearing timid on the surface, Tokiko always did have a tendency to bully those weaker than her, and her husband was an endless source of stimulation. At this point, she viewed him not so much as a person, but more so as a doll in which she could endlessly torment for her own pleasure. Tokiko continued to lay there in the darkness, unable to escape into sleep, as she replayed the memories from the last 3 years playing over and over again. And soon she began to feel violent and wild. Although she knew that none of this was the caterpillar's fault, in her heart she blamed him, and her heart often spoke louder than her head. She got up and lit a lamp, and in the hazy orange light she could see her husband still staring at the roof unblinkingly with those sad and angry eyes. She makes her way over to the caterpillar, and before she can come to her senses, she suddenly straddles it. She grabs the man's shoulders and begins to shake violently. However, the caterpillar did not react. It just continued to look at her. She couldn't take it anymore. She grabbed the caterpillar's face and placed her thumbs over its eyes. She continued to scream when suddenly the caterpillar began to thrash more violently than it ever had before. It squirmed like hell, trying desperately to get her off of it. This shocked the woman because despite her years of torment, it had never acted this way before. Despite not having any limbs, it managed to muster just enough strength to cause her to lose her balance and fall off of him. Looking back towards her husband, it was only now in which Tokiko realized what she had done. In her rage, the woman had drove both her thumbs into the eyes of the caterpillar. She watched as it continued to scream in silence as blood poured from its eye sockets. Suddenly, the gravity of what she had just done struck Tokiko. The caterpillar could not move on its own. It could not hear or speak. All it could do was watch in silence as the world went by. But Tokiko had just closed that window to the outside world, plunging the caterpillar into total lonely darkness. She runs to get the doctor, but when she gets back, the caterpillar is still squirming in agony. However, the doctor could do nothing except give the man a painkiller. She sat by her husband's bedside for hours, the guilt making the passing of time irrelevant. She looked at Sangaga, totally unable to help him. All she could do was use her fingers to write forgive me," again and again on the man's yellow belly. However, he did not respond. It was only now did she recognize the humanity of the man and understand the gravity of her years of torment. The guilt was too much. She needed to see anyone other than the caterpillar. She runs to the main house to General Washio and confesses her sins from the last 3 years. After hearing Tokiko's confession, the general prepares a lantern to visit his lieutenant. They walk to the guest house in silence, and by the time they arrive, the house is empty. They both begin to frantically search the house for the caterpillar, but to no avail, until Tokiko notices something scribbled on the wall by her husband's bedside. It was an answer to the question she had spent hours asking, scribbling again and again on her husband's belly. It simply said, "Forgive." Tokiko knew exactly what it meant. The caterpillar was going to kill itself. They both run outside, looking through the tall grass, trying to find him. Suddenly, Tokiko stops. She can hear a faint rustling, similar to that of a snake slithering through weeds. That's when she saw it, a creature, but she couldn't quite tell what it was. It then disappeared as if the earth had suddenly swallowed it whole. She runs to where she saw the creature, only to find the old, dried up well. The way it moved reminded her of something. It reminded her of how a caterpillar moves across a branch. That brings us to the end of the story, and I have to say, I am left with a horrible feeling inside. The caterpillar is one of those stories that is just kind of grim from start to finish. In fact, if I had to describe to you what I thought hell on earth would look like, I think I'd describe a situation very similar to that of the husband in this story. This is getting a bit personal, but I would say my biggest fear is probably becoming a paraplegic. And so in the case of the caterpillar, the thought of being in that situation and then the person you love most in the world and your sole caretaker just decides to torment you for 3 years before violently blinding you. That just sounds like it sucks. That sounds awful. However, one of the things I really like about the story, and I think is a testament to Ranpo's writing ability, is that despite the inexcusable things that the wife does, we still kind of have this sense of pity for her, which I think is really cool. She also lost her life when he got injured, and despite it not being rational, you can kind of understand why she blames her husband and holds this resentment towards him. Like, she is also a victim in a lot of ways. Like, the one person she can talk to about this, General Washio, is constantly like reaffirming and telling her that what she's doing is her duty and that she needs to kind of dedicate her life to someone else's, even when they can't give her anything in return. This isn't to say anything she does is justified, because just because you were given a bad hand in life doesn't mean you get to torment the one person who has it worse than you. I think it's just the sign of a very talented writer that you can explain a character's motivations and why they do the messed up things they do and still have the reader sympathize with them, but still not kind of excuse what they're doing or saying that what they're doing is anyway morally right. Also, by doing this, it just makes the ending hit so much harder for me. The story ends with Sangaga forgiving his wife despite the years of torment she put him through. And I think this goes to show that he understood her, and by an extension of that was able to show her grace, which he didn't have to do at all. Which makes when he does what he does at the end of the story, it's not so much as him freeing himself, but it's him freeing himself and his wife, which just makes the whole ending just hauntingly sad. I think if a lesser writer made the story, it would have just been, oh, she's abusive and isn't that scary? But what makes the caterpillar so good is that she is an abuser against her better judgment. Like, keep in mind, in order to make these videos, I have to cut a lot of stuff out, which means I sometimes also have to cut out some important character beats. The reason I bring this up is because when you read this for yourself, it's pretty easy to get a sense that Tokiko, despite everything, still loves her husband and has this intense feeling of remorse every time she does something cruel towards him. It does make you think that if she had the proper support systems and she wasn't completely isolated from everyone, would she still be abusive? And I don't know. And this is one of the reasons why I have branded this story as one of the most uncomfortable I have ever read. And that is because it poses a very sour question. Like, is it possible for life to screw you over so badly that you end up becoming this abusive monster? Because I think most people will wholeheartedly believe that they wouldn't. However, you just don't know until you're put in that situation. Anyway, that's my thoughts. I just want to take a quick moment at the end of this video to say thank you to everyone who commented on my human chair video. I've wanted to be a YouTuber ever since I was a little kid, and even though I'm still very far off doing that professionally, all your comments and support on the last video made it so that it was the first time in which I didn't feel silly for having that dream. I'm going to stick with these horror retellings with a particular focus on international horror, because a lot of the stories I've read are really, really cool and unique, as well as I like the idea of being able to bring these really well-made pieces of horror fiction to audiences that would not normally have read them. Anyway, if you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing. It really does help me out. And if you have any recommendations for stories you want me to cover, please leave a comment below. I do read them all. And that's all from me, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Bye.